Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Following the decision by the Permanent Court of International Arbitration in The Hague a few days ago regarding the Philippines' disputed claims in the South China Sea, all eyes are now turning to other claimants in the region to see what they will do next. In particular, three of those countries, Malaysia, Brunei and Vietnam, are members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Although the majority of the 10-nation bloc do not have territorial disputes with China, the ongoing disputes have not been conducive to the ASEAN nations coming to consensus on a number of issues. I'm joined today by Tan Sri Rustam Muhammad Isa, Chairman and Chief Executive of the Malaysian Institute of Strategic and International Studies and former Secretary General of Malaysia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But before we start, let's look at this.
Back to talks. After 3 years of hiking tensions over the South China Sea, new Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte chose a different way to his predecessor Aquino III and decided to resume talks with China over territorial disputes. President Duterte is reportedly speaking to former President Fidel Ramos about becoming the Philippines' envoy to China for talks. It would be the first time for Filipino officials visiting China since a tribunal in Hague released a ruling on the arbitration filed by Aquino's government. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said China welcomes the move. China has always insisted on bilateral talks as the solution of territorial disputes. Leaders in the region agree that the arbitration case has complicated the situation.
I think the real issue is that something like the South China Sea, both sides need to sit together and have a discussion.
The fault lines between us and among us that we have, that we can manage all these problems peacefully, diplomatically, without violence.
China has openly voiced its stance on the disputes, insisting that the arbitration ruling on the South China Sea case will have no impact on China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights in the region. So far, China has signed boundary agreements through bilateral negotiations with 12 of the 14 countries it shares a border with, under the principle of equal consultation and empathy. Through talks, China and Vietnam has also reached a consensus on the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf limits of the territorial waters in the North Gulf, a clear signal of China's sincerity for good relations.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you.
Are you surprised by China's defiance towards the ruling of The Hague? And do you think this is likely to undermine our relationship with ASEAN?
No, firstly, I think China's reaction has been expected. In fact, even a few months ago, I think in a number of conferences that I've attended, we have had some indication that China will not accept the ruling. The fact that China did not even respond to the initial approach made by the Philippines to the tribunal goes to show that China is not in favor of it, or in favor of the action taken in the first place. Now, I don't think this is going to affect relations between China and ASEAN because it's a ruling. It is another milestone in the story relating to the South China Sea.
Historical claims
Yes.
Are not addressed by the ruling. And China turned down the offer to be involved in the legal process in The Hague, largely because, A, we don't think this arbitral tribunal will be able to address the issue of sovereignty. Secondly, China said diplomacy had not been totally exhausted.
Yes.
We asked Manila to follow our advice in going to the table for negotiations, but we were given a cold shoulder. In this case, after the ruling, do you think the newly elected President Rodrigo Duterte will accept the terms of China and indeed answer the appeal from the Malaysian government to find a constructive way, to address the issue in a constructive way by exercising restraint?
Well, from what I have learned is that the President has decided to appoint the former President Ramos, to be some sort of special envoy to discuss these matters with China. And I think this is a positive move, and we should welcome this.
Malaysia is one of the claimants. From the very beginning of this process of disputes, do you believe DOC or COC or UNCLOS would be the final solution?
Well, you see, any final solution to sovereignty claims would have to be, I suppose, on the basis of negotiations, on the basis of dialogue. The UNCLOS is, of course, the basis for the principles of international law that needs to be taken into account. Similarly, the DOC will provide the guidelines for how states should act in this case. Now, what is important, I think, is now ASEAN and China should work closely towards achieving the COC.
Article 298 of UNCLOS encourages all the parties in the dispute to go to the negotiating table instead of turning to a confrontational approach, such as going to The Hague. China says it's unfair to accuse China of saying no to UNCLOS because we did use law as our weapon to persuade other claimants to join us in the negotiation. So when you say all claimants, all countries involved in the game should have to comply with the law, do you think what China did is also a kind of a compliance with law?
Well, I haven't really gone into those areas, really, but I would say that what is important is that all countries should respect international law. How that is interpreted is up to those countries concerned, I think, because the Law of the Sea Convention itself is something that was diplomatically worked out by member states. It took a long time for it to be finally agreed upon by the member states of the United Nations. The negotiations were arduous. Now, there are certain things that may have been omitted. There are certain things that were perhaps purposely vague. But still, the point is that I suppose every country has the right to decide on how it should.
Who is militarizing the South China Sea?
What is important is that countries, whether they are from the region, whether it's China or the ASEAN member states, or whether it's the United States or others, should ensure that there is no tension in the South China Sea. Because we need the South China Sea that is peaceful, that is stable, that is open to everyone, because it is an important body of water for purposes of trade, for purposes of communication, for purposes of connectivity among countries.
China is a big beneficiary of the existing international economic order and certainly the security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region ever since we started the opening policy 3 decades and a half ago. There's no reason for the Chinese government officials to threaten our neighboring economies by jeopardizing the freedom of navigation or overflight. China has made this very clear. However, we are not trusted. We are not trusted by major powers who decide to patrol the international waters and to use gumbo policy. What do you think of this security dilemma for other observers and claimants?
Now, you see, if you talk about others, and if you mean the United States, of course there's a problem between the United States and China, essentially.
What kind of problems?
Yeah, well, when you talk about patrolling and all that. Now, I fully understand that, you know, as I said earlier, the South China Sea is a body of water that is important not only to China, but also to the rest of us. It is important to the ASEAN countries. Trade between ASEAN and China goes through the South China Sea, and ASEAN and China are important trading partners. There are many things that we do together. And the South China Sea is also connected with the Straits of Malacca, for example. And the Straits of Malacca is very important to countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore. 90,000 vessels, ships, pass through the Straits of Malacca every year. And
every year?
Every year. And I think 80% of this go through the South China Sea subsequently, either from the South China Sea or into the South China Sea. Now, you see, so some people say freedom of navigation is very important. Yes, I agree with that. But so far, I've not seen any evidence that freedom of navigation has been impinged. You know, ships are still sailing in the South China Sea, so there shouldn't be any problem in that regard. But I think what is important is for China to give the assurance that it will ensure that the South China Sea is open. And I believe that it is in China's interest, and I'm sure China understands this, it is in China's interest to keep it open because you depend on the South China Sea.
The understatement of what you say means China has not made it clear that we will not guarantee the navigation.
No, China has made it clear. It's just that...
But you're asking for an assurance.
No,
what kind of an assurance?
This is what I'm saying, you know, the assurance to those people who doubt it. Now, there will be people who will continue to doubt this. You know, for those who understand this, as I said, because China depends on trade, and a lot of this trade goes through the South China Sea. I don't think it is that China would want to jeopardize that.
The United States has said at the very beginning of this process and crisis that it would not take side on the issue of sovereignty. But following the ruling, China comes under huge pressure from the United States urging us to take the arbitration. And China says no. We stated our position over and over very clearly that we would have no acceptance, no participation, so on and so forth. So don't you think this is a confrontation and the United States is taking side with the other claimants?
As I said, whatever happens between the United States and China is a question relating to the relations between the United States and China. And I think it is also wrong to assume that others can be dragged into this. You see, what is important, if you're looking at Malaysia and China, for example, we're the best of friends. Malaysia is the first ASEAN country that established diplomatic relations with China in 1974. Premier Li Keqiang had just made a visit to Malaysia a few months ago, and a number of agreements were signed. There's a lot of investments coming from China into Malaysia and Malaysian investments into China. And Malaysia is China's largest trading partner in ASEAN. So that speaks for itself, I think.
Are you confident that Vietnam will take side with the United States on the issue of South China Sea so that ASEAN is likely to be divided because you are reluctant to take side under pressure?
I think moving forward on the South China Sea, what is important is that one, ASEAN countries, all the ASEAN member countries, together with China, should work out the COC, and then efforts should be made to reduce tension, efforts should be made to find a lasting solution to the problem.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Tan Sri Rustam Muhammad Isa, Chairman and Chief Executive of the Malaysian Institute of Strategic and International Studies. We'll be back in a few minutes. Don't go away. Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Huang.
Thank you.
Professor Huang, there are many issues concerning the South China Sea, and one focus in dispute is militarization. The US accused China of endangering the freedom of navigation and the freedom of overflight. China says no, it's you whose patrols of the waters threaten to endanger our sovereignty, so on and so forth. Here is the standoff between Washington and Beijing. What do you think of militarization?
First, as a militarization, how you define it? If you define militarization as you put any weapons on the spot, that's militarization. That's first definition. If we go for this definition, and China can absolutely not do anything in South China Sea. But another definition is that, yes, everyone deserves the right to defend itself. So for defensive purpose, if I put weapons on the places that belongs to me, to defend my own security and safety, then that's fine, that's not militarization. But if I put offensive weapons in the place, and the purpose I put offensive weapons in that area is to attack others, and that is not allowed. So first, what is a definition of militarization? Right now, obviously, that inconsistency, if not contradictory in this. You cannot say, okay, you cannot do whatever military operation in the region. If you do it, it's militarization. And I can do it because I'm the one who guarantors the international peace and stability. Then I can do whatever I want, then that is. So there are two issues. Number one, how you define it. Number two, do you have a universal standard or have a bio standards? That's an issue. And another issue which I mentioned about the freedom of navigation. Again, first we have to define the term to see if we're on the same page. Of course, no one has a freedom to navigate or to fly in other people's territory. So if this is my territory, you don't have a freedom to come in. You should have my agreement or approval. But if it's international territory, or international space, or international water, everybody has a freedom to go. So in that regard, then the sub-issue is that in the international space, in the international territory, should we have certain limitations or constraints on the military vehicles to fly? And of course, the United States said, look, if it's international space, if it's national water, United States military can also operate, which is true because the United States is a global cop. And the United States does have a commitment and responsibility to maintain peace and stability. That's a fact. In the past 70 years, the United States has taken major responsibility to keep peace and stability in the region, although it's in U.S. term. For example, Strait of Malacca is important for all of us. But no one has soldiers here. It's the United States who is doing that. We accept, I think China should accept and acknowledge this reality. But the issue is that, do you have that kind of freedom of military operation in the water close to me, especially in the 200 miles? That's where the agreement.
There is indeed a broad
is.
Recognition on the side of the Chinese that the United States has been the architect of the security structure in the Pacific Ocean, I mean in the Asia-Pacific region. Mm-hmm. However, do you think the alleged expansion of our maritime features in the South China Sea threaten to disrupt the regional order that was established by the United States since the end of the Second World War? Does that mean that inevitably there's going to be a collision, a head-on collision between the two powers? China wants to be a major maritime power, and the United States has long assumed the leadership in the West Pacific, and therefore many foresee an inevitable collision.
I think, indeed, let's first get the facts right. First, as a Chinese, we should realize that China's rise is the single most significant factor to change the strategic landscape or strategic balance in the region. That's a fact. China's been growing so fast. For example, just 10 years ago, China has very weak or no capability to really manage the South China Sea. Chinese warship cannot come over. Chinese airplane can only fly 800 meters. But now China has more and more power and capability. That fact itself has changed strategic balance in the region. That's a fact. But the point is, just like you mentioned, will this kind of change will undermine peace and stability that has been maintained in the past decade? That's another issue.
What do you think of the issue of the ambiguous, quote-unquote, the ambiguous 9-dash line? The allegation that China wants to take up to 85% of the South China Sea as its own backyard. I mean, this is a pretty and generates headlines the world over. China says, wait a minute, this is an issue that's been abused by some of the media players. What do you think?
I think first we have to accept 9-dash line or U-shaped line is a historical fact. We know that one of the important foundation for the system in the region or international system architecture region is that all the territory occupied or stolen by the Japanese imperialism will have returned to the original owner or country. But in 1945, when Japan was defeated, at that time, Japan occupied the entire South China Sea. United States fought the bloodiest battle ever island by island to defeat the Japanese in South China Sea, and then who the South China Sea should return to. Japanese delinquished its ownership of South China Sea. And at that time, let's keep in mind, in 1945-46, only two countries in the region, China, at that time called Republic, and the Philippines. But the Cairo Declaration, Potsdam Declaration, said very clearly that all the territory occupied by Japanese imperial forces should return, and return to, of course, China. That's why in 1946, it is American warship carries Chinese soldier to come to South China investigation and then name all the rocks and the islands. And at that time, we found out the only islands that is habitable, have fresh water, is the Taipingdao. So China put the troops there, and it's still there.
You mean the KMT government put the troops there?
Yeah, so in that survey, they draw 11 dash line. Now it's a 9 dash line. At that time, only two countries has legitimate power or right to accept it or not. One is China. It was drawn by the Chinese. Of course, China accepted. And another is the Philippines.
By the way, why the 11 dash line has become a 9 dash line?
Oh, in 1965, we know there is a historical fact. We know that Vietnam War, the Ho Chi Minh led the northern Vietnamese fighting the American-supported southern Vietnamese. And in return, because of fighting in South Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and his forces will have to ship the ammunitions, supports, all the material and soldiers from north to south. They usually go by the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But the Ho Chi Minh Trail was heavily bombarded by the United States. So another route is by the sea. But by the sea, it will cross 11 dash line into Chinese territory line. So at that time, there is an agreement between Chinese government under the leadership of Mao Zedong, the Zhou Enlai, and the Ho Chi Minh that China will compromise 2 dash lines so that Ho Chi Minh can use that route to ship its soldiers, ammunition to the south. So that's why it became 11 dash line. So that's an example of a cooperation between China and North Vietnam at that time. And that should be a good memory between the two countries. But now, going back, why the 11 dash line becomes so controversial? Because after the national independence movement in 1950 and the 60s, Malaysia became independent, 1957. And in 1975, Vietnam has become a unified country under today's Vietnamese government. And Brunei was independent in 1967. And all of a sudden, all those countries re-established as countries. So their view, the perception, and their understanding of 9 dash line is very, very controversial, different. Because Malaysia, Brunei, all the countries, they deserve a piece of South China Sea. Vietnam, after unification, realized South China Sea is very important to them. And the Philippines also, oh, South China Sea is so important. So all of them began to charge 9 dash line. But the fact remains unchanged. 11 dash line, 9 dash line was drawn in 1946 and was published in 1947 on the map of China. And at 1952 San Francisco Peace Treaty Conference, even though neither People's Republic of China or Taiwan attended the meeting, but no one at that time challenged 11 dash line. People began to charge 11 dash line or 9 dash line only recently because everyone wanted a new peace. On the other hand, of course, Deng Xiaoping himself said there is a dispute because he said sovereignty is China's, but let's shelve the dispute, join the development.
That's a very famous
China also
statement.
compromised a little bit.
That is a famous statement.
Yeah, so that's why 9 dash line has become a controversial issue and become a strategically ambiguous line.
Before 1991, when the Cold War came to an end, it seemed the United States had been supportive of China one way or another, despite the conflicts that took place between China and Vietnam, fighting for islands or the border clashes. But why does the United States change its position nowadays? It challenges whatever claims China makes, including perhaps the construction of a maritime Silk Road, to say nothing Belt and Road Initiative, which covers much of the Eurasia continent.
I think that the fact is that China did fight for its territory sovereignty in 1974, 1984, 1988 against Vietnam. In all those 3 fights, all the international media, including US government, actually if not support China, they lean towards China. Because at that time, Vietnam is an ally of Soviet Union, and China, of course, is a quasi-ally of the United States. So at that time, the United States was supportive. And also another fact, we all know that during the Vietnam War period, the United States had to ship a lot of supply from Philippines. Vietnam is, the military base in Philippines, to Vietnam. That will cross the South China Sea. Every time it crosses South China Sea, they will ask the Taiwanese government, Republic of China in Taiwan, for approval. That means the United States accept the 9-dash line within its China's territory. That's a fact. And Fu Yi and Wu Shichun just published a paper to say the fact as it is. And the United States began to turn its position or change its position gradually in the 1990s. First, like you said, Soviet Union collapsed. And China stand out as a socialist country. And then in the 1990s, China and the Philippines began to have a dispute, exposed on the South China Sea, and the United States began to turn side. But the turning point is 2010, where the United States decided to adopt a new policy called the rebalance. At that time, the United States returned to Asia and then pivot or rebalance. And if you want to change your policy, have a strategic approach to this region, you need something to engage the dominant power in this region, that is China. China is rising. So the United States look, how are we going to deal with China to return Asia? I got to have a justification, an excuse, or strategic justification, not only to justify U.S. so-called return to Asia, but to enable the United States to gain strategic initiatives, to gain moral high ground in the region. So 4 issues the United States can really engage Chinese for this possible policy goals: the Taiwan issue, South China Sea issue, North Korean nuclear weapon issue, and Tibet or Xinjiang issue. After serious consideration, they realized North Korea issue is not a good one for this purpose. Taiwan, of course, has become United States strategic liability, no longer asset. And South China Sea issue is an issue that the United States can take full advantage to engage Chinese, not only to gain strategic initiative, but to gain the moral high ground, put China on the defensive side. That's why at the conference, APEC summit in Vietnam in 2010, both secretaries, Secretary Hillary Clinton and Secretary Robert Gates, made a surprise speech on South China Sea. They said the United States has a commitment and credibility to peace and stability in the region. The United States will uphold the freedom of navigation. The United States will stop international expansion, whatever. So all of a sudden, after that, South China Sea has become a huge issue, and China is on defensive because, after all, it's the biggest country in the region, China, against 4 small countries. And second, it involves ASEAN, the only international institution in the region. Last but not the least, the status quo indeed has been changed or altered by China's fast rise.